I discovered my adopted parents had been lying about my real father being dead. He was actually a billionaire looking for me. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when I was 28 years old and struggling to pay rent for my cramped studio apartment in downtown Chicago. I had just finished my third cup of instant coffee, trying to muster the energy to tackle another day of job hunting, when I heard the mail slot clatter. Among the usual bills and junk mail was an envelope with my name written in elegant handwriting, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of expensive paper with a simple message asking me to meet someone at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The note mentioned they had information about my biological parents, something I had given up hoping to learn about years ago. My adoptive parents had always told me that both my birth parents had died in a car accident when I was barely 6 months old, leaving me with no family to claim me. I spent the entire morning pacing around my apartment, debating whether this was some kind of elaborate scam or if someone actually had real information about where I came from. The curiosity eventually won out, and I found myself sitting in the specified coffee shop at exactly 3 o'clock, nervously scanning every person who walked through the door. A woman in her 50s approached my table, impeccably dressed in a way that screamed money and sophistication. She introduced herself as a private investigator and explained that she had been hired to find me by someone who claimed to be my biological father. My heart nearly stopped as she placed a manila folder on the table between us and told me that everything I had been told about my origins was a lie. According to the documents she showed me, my mother had indeed died when I was young, but my father was very much alive and had been searching for me for nearly 3 decades. The investigator explained that my adoptive parents had been contacted by him multiple times over the years, but they had refused to tell him where I was or even confirm that I was alive and well. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, and I felt years of trust and love for the people who raised me crumble in an instant. I had always wondered why I looked nothing like my adoptive parents, why I seemed to have interests and talents that came from nowhere, why I sometimes felt like I was living someone else's life. She handed me a business card with an address in Manhattan and told me that my biological father would be waiting for me there the following weekend if I chose to meet him. The investigator mentioned that he was a successful businessman who had never stopped believing he would find me someday, and that he had resources that could change my life completely. I spent the rest of the week in a daze, calling in sick to the temporary job I had been working and barely eating or sleeping. The anger toward my adoptive parents consumed me, and I found myself remembering all the times I had asked about my birth family, all the times they had looked me in the eyes and repeated the same story about the car accident. The decision to confront them came suddenly on Friday evening. I drove to their house in the suburbs, the same house where I had grown up, and demanded answers. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful experiences of my life, as they broke down and admitted that they had been lying to me for decades. They explained that my biological father had been involved in some kind of legal trouble when I was born, and they had been told by the adoption agency that it would be better for everyone if all contact was severed completely. They claimed they had been trying to protect me from a potentially dangerous situation, but as the years passed, they became too afraid to tell me the truth. The worst part was discovering that my biological father had been sending them money for my care and education throughout my childhood, money that they had accepted while telling me he was dead. They had used his financial support to give me a comfortable life, while simultaneously denying me the chance to know him or even know that he existed. I left their house that night feeling like my entire identity had been built on a foundation of lies, and I knew that I had to meet this man who had been searching for me all these years. The train ride to New York felt like the longest journey of my life, and I kept rehearsing what I would say to someone who was technically my father but remained a complete stranger. The address led me to a gleaming office building in Midtown Manhattan, and I found myself in an elevator heading to the top floor, my palms sweating and my heart racing. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area that looked like something out of a movie, all marble and glass and expensive furniture. A secretary led me through a series of hallways to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The man sitting behind the massive desk looked up when I entered, and I immediately saw my own eyes staring back at me from a face that was clearly an older version of what I might look like in 20 years. He stood up slowly, as if he was afraid that moving too quickly might cause me to disappear, and I could see tears forming in his eyes as he took in my appearance. For several minutes, we just stood there looking at each other, neither of us knowing how to bridge the gap of nearly 3 decades of separation. He told me his name and explained that he had built a technology company from nothing, starting in his garage shortly after I was born and growing it into one of the most successful firms in the country. He showed me photographs that he had somehow obtained over the years, pictures of me at various ages that I had never seen before, proof that he had been watching from a distance whenever possible. The story he told me was completely different from what I had been led to believe about the circumstances of my birth. He explained that my mother had been his college girlfriend, and they had planned to get married when they discovered she was pregnant with me. However, she had died from complications during childbirth, and he had been so devastated by grief that he had made some poor decisions in his business dealings. He admitted that he had been involved in some questionable financial transactions in those early days, trying to build his company while dealing with the loss of the woman he loved. The legal troubles that my adoptive parents had been warned about were real, but they had been resolved years ago, and he had spent the intervening decades building a legitimate empire while never giving up hope of finding me. What shocked me most was learning that he had been trying to contact me directly for years, hiring private investigators and lawyers to track down my location. He had even tried to challenge the adoption legally, but the system had been designed to protect my anonymity, and my adoptive parents had successfully blocked every attempt at contact. He showed me a room in his penthouse apartment that he had maintained as a shrine to the son he had never been allowed to know. It was filled with gifts he had bought for me over the years, birthday presents and Christmas presents that had never been given, all carefully wrapped and labeled with the dates he had purchased them. The emotional weight of seeing 2 decades worth of unopened presents was almost too much to bear. There were toys from when I was a child, books from my teenage years, and even practical items like clothes and electronics that he had hoped to give me as I grew into adulthood. He explained that his wealth had grown exponentially over the years, and that he had always planned to share everything with me once we were reunited. He showed me legal documents that proved I was the sole heir to his entire fortune, worth more money than I could have imagined in my wildest dreams. But the most surprising revelation came when he told me about the steps he had taken to ensure my future, even without knowing where I was or whether I was alive. He had been anonymously funding scholarships at schools I had attended, making donations to organizations in my name, and even arranging for job opportunities to be made available to me without my knowledge. I realized that some of the lucky breaks I had experienced in my life, opportunities that had seemed to come out of nowhere, had actually been orchestrated by this man who had been trying to help me from the shadows. The summer internship that had led to my first real job, the scholarship that had helped me finish college, even the apartment I was currently living in had all been influenced by his behind-the-scenes efforts. The revelation that my entire adult life had been partially shaped by someone I had never met was both touching and unsettling. It made me question how much of my success had been earned through my own efforts and how much had been the result of his invisible assistance. He offered me a position in his company, a chance to learn the business from the ground up and eventually take over the empire he had built. But he made it clear that there were no expectations or obligations, that he simply wanted the opportunity to get to know the son he had missed watching grow up. I spent the next several weeks traveling back and forth between Chicago and New York, slowly getting to know this man who was my biological father while trying to process the magnitude of everything that had been revealed. We would spend hours talking about my childhood, my dreams, my fears, and my hopes for the future. He told me stories about my mother, sharing photographs and memories that helped me understand where I had come from and why I had always felt like there was something missing from my life. He explained personality traits that I had inherited from both parents, talents and interests that suddenly made sense in the context of my genetic heritage. The hardest part was deciding what to do about my relationship with my adoptive parents. They had raised me with love and provided me with a stable home, but they had also robbed me of the chance to know my biological father during the most formative years of my life. The betrayal cut deep, and I found myself struggling to forgive them for the decades of deception. My biological father encouraged me to try to rebuild that relationship, pointing out that they had genuinely believed they were protecting me and that their love for me had been real, even if their methods had been misguided. He suggested that perhaps we could all find a way to move forward together, creating a new kind of family that honored both the past and the future. The decision to relocate to New York came gradually, as I began to see the possibilities that lay ahead of me. My biological father offered me a penthouse apartment in his building, a salary that was more than I had ever dreamed of earning, and the chance to learn about industries and opportunities that I had never known existed. But beyond the material benefits, he offered me something even more valuable, the chance to understand who I was and where I came from. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I was part of something bigger than myself. The transition was not without its challenges. I had to learn to navigate a world of wealth and privilege that was completely foreign to me, while also dealing with the emotional complexity of building a relationship with someone who was both my father and a stranger. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed by the luxury and extravagance of my new life, times when I missed the simplicity of my old existence. But there were also moments of pure joy, when I would catch my father looking at me with such pride and love that it took my breath away. He introduced me to a network of successful people who became mentors and friends, guiding me through the process of learning to manage wealth and responsibility. I discovered talents and interests that I had never had the opportunity to explore, and I began to understand the potential that had always existed within me. The most surprising development was discovering that I had a natural aptitude for the business world, an intuitive understanding of markets and opportunities that seemed to come from nowhere. My father explained that he had possessed the same instincts when he was my age, and that perhaps this was part of my genetic inheritance. As I settled into my new life, I began to understand that the years of separation had been a tragedy for both of us. My father had missed the chance to watch me grow up, to be there for my first steps and my first words, to help me through the challenges of adolescence and young adulthood. But I had also missed the chance to know him, to learn from his experiences and his mistakes, to benefit from his wisdom and his resources during the times when I had struggled most. We had both lost precious time that could never be recovered, but we were determined to make the most of the time we had left. The story of my reunion with my biological father spread through certain circles, and I found myself fielding calls from journalists and writers who wanted to tell our story. But we both agreed that this was a private matter, something too precious and personal to be shared with the world. Instead, we focused on building our relationship day by day, learning to be father and son despite the unusual circumstances of our reunion. We traveled together, attended cultural events, and spent countless hours just talking about life and the future. The guilt about my adoptive parents continued to weigh on me, and eventually, I decided to invite them to New York to meet my biological father. The meeting was awkward and emotional, but it marked the beginning of a healing process that would take years to complete. My biological father was gracious and understanding, thanking my adoptive parents for raising me and acknowledging the sacrifices they had made. He made it clear that he did not want to replace them in my life, but rather to add another dimension to the family structure that had shaped me. The legal and financial aspects of my new situation required careful navigation, as lawyers and accountants worked to ensure that my inheritance was properly structured and protected. I learned about trusts and investments, about charitable foundations and tax implications, about the responsibilities that came with significant wealth. But the most important lesson I learned was about the power of perseverance and love. My biological father had never given up hope of finding me, even when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. His determination had eventually led to our reunion, proving that some bonds cannot be broken by time or distance. Looking back on that Tuesday morning when the letter arrived, I realized that it marked the beginning of a completely new chapter in my life. The scared, struggling young man who had been wondering how to pay rent had been transformed into someone with unlimited possibilities and resources. The relationship with my biological father continued to deepen as we spent more time together, and I began to see him not just as a successful businessman, but as a man who had carried the pain of losing his child for nearly 3 decades. His joy at our reunion was matched only by his determination to make up for lost time. The company he had built became a bridge between us, a shared project that allowed us to work together while building our personal relationship. I discovered that I had inherited not just his business acumen, but also his passion for innovation and his desire to make a positive impact on the world. As I write this, several years have passed since that first meeting in the coffee shop, and my life has been completely transformed. I have a relationship with my biological father that grows stronger every day, a career that challenges and fulfills me, and financial security that allows me to help others in ways I never could have imagined. The story serves as a reminder that sometimes the truth is more extraordinary than fiction, and that the people we are meant to find will eventually come into our lives, even if it takes decades for the connection to be made. My biological father never stopped believing that we would be reunited, and his faith was ultimately rewarded.